we're focusing today on the pension plan component of the compensation.
We lost the chair. Chair should be coming back in right now.
Someone kicked me out. Sorry about that. So we're going over the pension component of the compensation for our state representatives. And then Philip's going to walk through some of the key components there. So I'll turn it over to you, Philip, unless there's any questions before we get started here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so today we have some items to review in the legislative pension plan. I've had some discussions with the State Retirement Agency, who's the administering entity, and we've identified 4 areas that we've kind of flagged for you to take a closer look at. Just for some context, the legislative pension plan is a plan that is governed by the resolution that you all pass as this commission. And so the 2018 resolution is the current plan. In effect, its provisions are found under item 3A of that resolution. And the item 4 also applies to benefits in that pension plan. So real quick, I think I'd sent out to everyone the summary from the existing resolution and a copy of the resolution. If anyone has any questions about the general plan, I can answer that, or if you want, I can just jump right into some of the issues or the items that we flagged for you. All right, I'll go ahead and do that. So the first item, we've got 4 things, and 2 of them are kind of technical clarifying. One is I would consider clarifying, a little more complicated. Then there's a 4th one that's kind of follow up from some discussions that the prior commission had. So with that, let me share my screen. The first item I have for you is a technical correction or technical clarification in item 20 of the resolution. And this has to do with transfers of credit. So when a member doesn't vest, they have an opportunity, if they become a member of one of the other state plans, to transfer credit. And this is really just some cleanup. This provision right here in subsection B2 is referencing when a member has service occurring before January 8th, 1975. I checked with the retirement system and there are no current outstanding members that would meet this criteria. So this provision right here is obsolete. So just as a little bit of cleanup, I recommend to strike this provision and then just collapse B1 into one provision.
So Philip, there's no retirees. Is they're also saying that there's no retirees that fall into this category?
There would be retirees. There may be some retirees, but this is about a member who didn't hit their 8 years to vest. And so there's no outstanding former members with less than 8 years and service before 1975. And all the current members are post 1975 start dates.
Okay.
The next item we had flagged for you here. This is again just a little bit of cleanup. So the legislative pension plan is, again, it's subject to this commission's actions on the resolution, which that process occurs every 4 years. So unlike the other state plans that are in code, we can't go in every year and make corrective fixes and anything like that. So this is a provision dealing with obtaining military service credit. And the one thing I would just flag here is that there are regulations adopted by the system for processing these credit claims. I would just feel more comfortable to strike the particular COMAR code reference and just reference the Code of Maryland regulations. It's unlikely, but in the extent that there's a reorganization or a revision of the chapters changing the number designation, the resolution would be inconsistent with the regulations and could cause some confusion. And then getting into the more technical, the next item I have for you has to deal with the survivor benefits and an optional allowance that's available in the system. So the baseline for retirees and survivors of retirees in the system is a 50% survivor benefit. So the surviving spouse, or if there's no surviving spouse, the designated beneficiary would receive half of the retiree's allowance on the death of the retiree. For a spouse, that would begin at the death of the retiree. For a beneficiary, they would need to attain a minimum age to start drawing that benefit based on when the member first started their service in the legislature. There is another form of allowance that's available. It's an optional allowance that the member would elect when they're retiring that would provide a 100% survivor benefit. And the way this works is that at the time of retirement, the retiree would name the beneficiary that was going to receive this benefit. And there's an actuarial adjustment to the benefit that the member as a retiree receives, which then continues on to the designated beneficiary. The point of clarification that I would draw to your attention is that generally the default for the survivor benefits is to go to a surviving spouse. And so in this optional provision, you have that similar provision here to the retiree surviving spouse or the designated beneficiary, but under this option, you would be designating a beneficiary. And so it's a little unclear how this will work because the individual who is going to get that 100% survivor benefit, the calculation is going to be based on their age and the life expectancy. And so this language is a little unclear. And so in other plans that have automatic survivor benefits, we have provisions in state code that restrict their ability to select an optional form of allowance if there is a surviving spouse at the time of retirement. So that is one option for clarification that you all could look at. And along with that, under the designated beneficiary provisions in section 13, there's a provision here about recomputation of allowance. And so this is a situation where a named beneficiary dies before the retiree. This provision would allow another beneficiary to be selected, but this provision really only applies for the 100% survivor benefit because that benefit is based on the relative ages of the beneficiary and the retiree. So there would need to be a recalculation under that. Under the baseline benefit for the 50%, that's not an issue because that benefit is just 50% of the retiree's allowance. So under the baseline benefit, a retiree has a spouse, that spouse predeceases that retiree and they select somebody else. There's no recomputation required because it's just going to be based on the retiree's allowance. And whether it's a spouse or beneficiary, they start either at the death of the retiree if it's a spouse or at the attaining the minimum age. So if the commission's interested, I would recommend kind of cleaning up these three provisions to kind of make them consistent with what we do elsewhere in terms of survivor benefits and systems where there's the automatic deference to the surviving spouse.
Philip, can I just try to understand what you just said? Okay.
Yes.
So if, if I designate my spouse and I get the level option and my spouse passes away,
Mhm.
the beneficiary gets that same amount, or is it recalculated?
Well, no, and actually I have Ann Gothard from the retirement system. She's their director of legislative affairs. She may be able to flesh out a little more of the details on how that actually works in practice. There would need to be a recomputation if you're changing the beneficiary, and often that can result in a significant reduction in the benefit allowance.
Okay, so I'm just using the example. So I'm the legislator, and I've selected my level option, my spouse passes away. And if I designate another beneficiary who happens to be younger than my spouse was, I could be getting less money now, right? Because it's being readjusted.
Right.
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 Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
That's all. I just want to make sure I understood. So.
Right. And there are restrictions. So if it's not a spouse for the level benefit, or a disabled child, as defined under the Internal Revenue Code, it can't be somebody who's more than 10 years younger than the member for the level benefit.
And what are we trying to clarify? What are we trying to correct?
So it's this subsection C here is a little unclear because it's referencing payment to the retiree's spouse, if there is a spouse. But if there was a retiree who, say, wasn't married at the time of retirement, selected a different beneficiary, and then they died, this provision's a little unclear as to what the mechanics are. Does the surviving spouse automatically get that benefit, which was calculated on the age of a different person?
Okay, got it. Thank you.
And I don't think this option is heavily utilized. I don't know if Anne if you wanted to comment on how often this choice is taken.
We've only had 2 individuals in the last term select the 100%. And they both named their spouses.
Hey, Philip, is there language, you said it's inconsistent with what we see in some other places. Is there language that mirrors where you think it may go? Is there something? I wasn't sure if there was something that was provided that kind of shows what it should look like.
Yeah, I can send that around as follow-up. In state code for selection of options, there are some restrictions for some of the plans that have so the law enforcement, state police, and judges plans have default survivor benefits for retirees for spouses. And so in code and the provisions about selecting options, there are provisions in there that require, or I guess actually they preclude members retiring from the systems to select options if they have a spouse. So that's one option. I think the discussion would be about whether for the 100% survivor to maybe add a provision if there is a spouse at the time of retirement, whether you'd want to require that spouse to be the default selection, or if there is no spouse, then they can select somebody else to kind of clarify the, I guess, line of succession.
But as a default, if it's a default selection, does that then mean in those instances that someone can opt to do something different, knowing that it could result or will likely result in a reduced benefit, or are you saying that it's the default, meaning it can't be adjusted or changed?
Well, so for the baseline, the 50%, the default is a surviving spouse. So if you were to carry that to this, the change would be to clarify that the 100%, if you have a spouse at the time of retirement, that's who you would need to select if you're doing the option.
But could you do something different? Like for a scenario, what if you technically have a spouse, but you're going through a divorce or you're estranged or something like that? Like, is there what happens in a scenario or a situation like that?
So in a situation of divorce, it's there tends to be a process where a court can issue a domestic relations order that awards a former spouse a portion of the benefit when it's payable. That is something that happens in all of the plans. So that process would indicate a portion of the retiree's benefit if there is an award in a divorce proceeding. And these orders also, the system is a participant in making sure these orders are something that the system can administer in that process. So Anne, did you want to?
Yes, Philip, I'm sorry to interrupt, but to Mr. Davis's point, that's an interesting point that you're bringing up. Outside of the issue of the DRO that Philip was talking about as far as dividing the pension is concerned, if you are in the process of going through a divorce, let me understand if this is what you were asking. You're going through a divorce, but you're also retiring at the same time. And your concern is this individual who is retiring, but they're getting divorced, but are they going to have to be required to name their spouse? Because technically they're not divorced yet. And so now you've got the spouse on file as the beneficiary. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think in cases of like estrangement or something like that.
Mhm.
Sure. Or if you're separated, I know some people who have been separated for years and they just haven't gotten divorced, but technically they still have a wife. So as Philip was explaining with the basic allowance in that case, you can once you are divorced, you can come in and name another beneficiary for the basic allowance, the 50% joint and survivor. And there's no reduction to your benefit. There's no impact to you at all for that. There would be an impact with the optional retirement if you wanted to take the 100% joint and survivor and you had to name your spouse and you're going through the divorce. That would be a problem because after you're divorced, your spouse is still listed as your beneficiary. And if you want to change it, as Philip mentioned previously, is that now there's going to be a double reduction to your benefit because it's going to have to be recalculated for the new beneficiary. I hope I didn't just complicate it more.
And again, this is we're talking here about an optional form of allowance. So Commissioner Davis, to your point, in that situation where you had a member in the process of possibly getting divorced, they would know what the baseline benefit is, and they would also know what the ramifications of choosing the option would be. I would suppose if the option requires the spouse to be the first choice, then they would likely not select that option, especially since it would, in theory, reduce their retiree benefit as well. Because the retiree in the optional, the retiree benefit also gets reduced.
So I have a question for Anne. In most ERISA plans, it's required that it goes to the spouse. Is this plan covered by ERISA?
No, the governmental plans are not covered by ERISA. We follow ERISA for fiduciary responsibility language, but for plan provisions, we're not governed by them. It's not to say that, our state police plan, our judges plan, our law enforcement officer plan don't have components of the ERISA plans in them, in that they do have the default for the surviving spouses.
Okay. So this plan does not require the spouse to allow different beneficiaries, is that right?
You're talking about where the spouse could come in and ask for a waiver. They would waive their right to it so someone else could be put. No, and in fact, that's been asked in previous commissions. People have come forward and asked for spousal waivers. And Simon, you might remember when this has come up in the past. It's come up a couple times, and each time the commission has rejected that.
I was just asking if it's in there, but it's not. Okay, that's just all I needed. But thank you.
And as a quick follow-up, I think Philip, you had said that for the last term, there'd only been, I think, two occurrences or checking of the optional. Do we know over a longer period of time, let's say 4 years or something like that, like what the numbers are? Is it pretty consistent with just, or maybe not 4 years, but over a couple terms? Is it consistent with just a few folks selecting that option?
I can answer that, and I'm laughing because I think we did this, we went back to the inception of the plan a couple commissions ago when we got rid of, there were other options available. And what we found is at the time, there were 3 options, the 100% and 2 other options. Since the inception of the legislative plan, no one had ever accepted the 2 options that we got rid of. And I think only 2 or 3 people had accepted the 100%. So now in total, since 1971, 5 people have taken the 100% joint survivor.
Okay, thank you.
If there are no more questions about those provisions, I can move on to the final item. And this has to do with forfeiture of benefits. So item 4 was incorporated into the plan in 2010. And this provision provides that a member who is convicted of certain crimes committed during the member's term of office, they would forfeit their benefits to draw retirement from the system. The last commission had some discussion because there was statutory enactments that took effect for the constitutional officers that had some different provisions that would provide for some acknowledgement for situations where, because if a member is losing their benefit, any family members, a spouse or dependent children would also be losing out on that benefit. And the prior commission left the current provision in place. There have been a few instances of legislative members forfeiting their benefits under this provision since it's been in effect. In talking with Anne, the agency has not really been experiencing any administrative issues with administering the provision, but it does not have those protections. And there's kind of 2 classifications I would consider for that issue of protection. There's one, it's current spouses and children, and then the other one would be a situation where, as we were just previously talking about, if a member gets divorced and they get a domestic relations order, that domestic relations order can award the former spouse a portion of benefits when they're payable. That one, in code, we do for the constitutional officers have a protection for that, and then also another process for awarding a domestic relations order for current spouses and beneficiaries. I would note that provision has not been used yet. And so we don't know about any potential administrative quirks or difficulties with doing that. But I just wanted to bring that item to the attention of the commission since it was up for discussion the last time around.
So just to be clear, the item up for discussion is whether or not to provide some protection for the family member.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And an existing domestic relations order for a former spouse would be specifying what that former spouse is entitled to. And in that situation, they're presumably separate from the member. So you think of it as a pre-event DRO or a post-event.
Do you recall why? I mean, I was on the prior commission and I do remember discussing this, and I don't remember that we decided not to put in that protection. Do you remember what the rationale was, or what an argument would be not to include the protection?
So this is Simon. Yeah, you had a lengthy discussion about it last time around. I think probably it's a good idea just to have a little bit of history on this provision. This provision was never proposed by a compensation commission. It was specifically added in by the legislature in the 2010 resolution. And frankly, that was at a time when there were some quite significant issues around some of the members in the legislature, and this provision was added. It is, as Philip says, an extremely, I suppose, harsh provision compared to the provisions that have come into place through statute following that. The commission in 2014 looked at this provision and upheld it. And as you said, Stipple, in 2018, you looked at it again, mainly because there'd been these statutory changes that Philip talked about with regard to forfeiture for constitutional officers. At the time, I think the discussion, and if my memory serves, the discussion was really around the fact that, well, you know, the legislature had put this into place in 2010, and the consensus was it was not a complete consensus. It was an 8-to-1 decision, was to leave it at that time. And I think that there was a great deal of discussion about it, especially, and I know there was specific concern about the notion of if you had a spouse who had been divorced prior to, you know, that this provision would essentially kind of like nullify their ability to get access to a pension because the member loses the pension period. There was also a little concern about the same impact on any disabled child. It is as I said, it's the problem is as I see it, is that the legislature put this in place, but you're the only ones that can actually soften it, because I think it would be, if the legislature decided to try and do that themselves, one could make the reasonable argument that that's actually increasing their benefits, which is not something they're not allowed to do. So I said the last two commissions, the first one really kind of just upheld it. The second one, which was the one that you served on last time around, did consider it. And again, I guess the question to again bring up is whether this is overly harsh and doesn't take into consideration the ramifications on family members, especially family members who are, you know, have existing orders prior to anything that actually is done by a member. I think last time around that there was just too much concern about trying to make that change. But again, I think it's, as Philip said, it's probably something that the commission needs to consider, especially given the changes that have happened statutorily to other officers.
I'm curious on why this keeps coming up then. Why does it keep coming up if the commission makes a decision? I mean, there are other provisions of the pension plan we don't revisit every time. Why do we revisit this each time?
Well, I mean, you can, as a commission, you can revisit anything you want. We don't, I mean, you know, literally you can revisit absolutely anything you want. We don't kind of like go through, I mean, we go through in broad strokes, as we did at the first meeting, all the different aspects of the compensation to give you a sense of what's out there. And clearly, if you feel strongly that something should be changed, then that's absolutely your right as a commission to have that debate, whether it be salaries or anything to do with the pension system. I mean, I'm not going to, well, I'm hesitant to say this, but I mean, I do remember in the past that there's been a discussion about why there should be a legislative pension plan. But I don't think anybody, you know, has had that, you know, in terms of that serious debate in terms of changing it. But this comes up again, I think, because of the concern of the strict nature of this forfeiture provision. And that's why it's being brought to your attention.
Is there some group or individuals, or I'm just curious how this keeps popping up. I mean, we could be reviewing the level of the benefit, but we don't do that every time. I'm just curious how this keeps popping up. Is there someone that's pushing for this? Is there someone saying, did you make a mistake? I'm just trying to understand.
It had been flagged just because of the discussion from last time. And that it seemed that the discussion last time was there was some interest, but the commission didn't feel like it was in a place to decide. So it was more just to, you know, note it again. So, you know, if anyone wants to look at this a little more closely. So that was the reason for flagging it.
Okay, thank you.
Just a point, if this is something that we would want to explore, which we may want to define what the date is, so if the crime occurs, there's an investigation and a divorce, is underway, and the order gets put in place before a decision, that may change someone's perspective that if the divorce occurred before the crime. Potentially. So.
There's no further discussion on those. Those were the items that I brought, to just bring to your attention regarding the pension system. I don't know if anybody had any other questions about the legislative plan.
Well, the technical changes, were you planning to submit later at a later date, recommended language? Is that what the thought was?
Yes,
Okay.
for the decision meeting at the next, for the final meeting.
So just on that last one, I think you said it was harsher than some of the other state retirement plans that you see. So would the recommended language come from those others that are slightly have more protections?
I wasn't flagging the triggering provisions. It was more the following up from the last commission on the discussion about the protections for the innocent spouses. We can.
No, that's what I mean. So to put in order to put in a protection, I'm assuming there would be additional language, or like, how would we go about adding the protection? And, I don't know who was just speaking, but, deciding exactly when to put in that protection or in what circumstances to put in that protection. I think you said there were others that we could look at to see how they've done that.
Yeah, so there's existing law for the constitutional officers. And in that law, there is a provision specifying that forfeiture would not impair or alter an existing domestic relations order. So that'd be the instance where you have the divorce before, the conviction incident. And then there's also another process which has not been used yet. So given that you can only make changes and corrections to this plan every 4 years, that may end up being a little more on the complicated side. Sometimes with the pension stuff, the simpler the concept is to just on its face, the more complicated the implementation can be.
Okay.
But for sure, I mean, just to be clear, I think the notion would be that any changes that people are interested in, I mean, we would prepare for a decision meeting. So especially, you could actually see the proposed language. I think that's actually always the best course of action if we can do that. And that would be true for anything that anybody wants to propose on any of these provisions. It's particularly true for the pension plan piece, which is generally more complicated than the rest of it.
So if there were no more questions on that, we did have a few items of follow-up for you. At the last meeting, there was a question about the member salaries adjusted for cost of living. And Simon has done some work on that. Let me pull that up for you.
Great, thanks, Philip. There's two charts I prepared just to kind of like put them in perspective. We've labeled these as Exhibit 47 and 48. The first one is just the actual legislative salaries unadjusted This is the same data we presented last time around from NCSL. You can see where Maryland falls there relative to other states, California at the high end. So then what I did was I adjusted it for cost of living data for the third quarter of calendar 2021, which is the next slide. Essentially, what you can see is in virtually all of the salaries, kind of like most of the salaries at the top end adjust down because the states at the top end were relatively high cost of living states. Maryland's salary adjusted for cost of living is just above 40,000 from 50,000. In broad strokes, what this shows is the same kind of movement down relative that we showed to the relative household income and per capita income. Maryland is a high cost state, has a relatively high cost of living. So that $50,000 salary doesn't quite buy so much. It goes down to just about 40,000. So we moved down to about 19th, 18th, 19th in the pack. Again, this data is based on state level data. It's not based on regional county level data. So even within the, even within the state, we know we have high cost and low cost, relatively high cost and relatively low cost areas. But the data I had available was at a state level. And it does show the relative buying power of the state salary. And it's obviously, as we'd expect, lower in Maryland because of our relatively high cost of living. So that's, it's kind of, I think I went back and looked, I think it's pretty similar to the data that I showed the last commission in terms of the relative impact. So I don't know if anybody has any questions about that.
So what was the difference between 47 and 48 again?
So 47 is just unadjusted for, it's just unadjusted income. It's just the absolute dollar values, and 48 is actually adjusted for the cost of living. I just put the same, I put them on the same scale and I put it in the same format so you can kind of visually see the movement down of that solid black bar, relatively speaking.
So if I look on here, if I do an eyeball, I think on this chart, Maryland is, of those states that are hybrid, it looks like there's 4 ahead of them.
Yeah.
Am I right? About 4.
I think, yeah, I think so. I think that's about right.
So of the 26 that are hybrid or part-time, we're somewhere around, again, I'm just eyeballing it, 4 to 6 in the top 4 to 6. Okay.
Yeah, we're still at the high end. I mean, it's very difficult because I mean, one of the things we often show people because they want to see, what surrounding states are, and the problem with that kind of analysis in this setting is that legislative salaries are a very peculiar breed of data. I mean, Virginia, which has a much larger, actually has a larger economy than Maryland, has a relatively high cost of living like Maryland, is much lower down because their legislative salaries are very low. Delaware actually kind of moves ahead of us, and Pennsylvania, under the adjusted for cost of living, is the highest highest state salary, legislative salary. It is what it is. I mean, as I said, because you're talking about salaries which are not really related to any kind of market forces, then it's hard to make a comparison. I would note, going back to your point there about hybrid, we did develop a very simple survey for the presiding officers to send to members about how much the work the members do in terms of their legislative activity, both in session and out of session. We've got some preliminary responses on that, but we're waiting to get as many responses as we can. So we'll certainly have that to you for the final decision meeting. I'm hoping to get a response rate of at least 25% of the members. That would be somewhat worthwhile. 50% would be great. But that data is kind of coming in. The data that Philip and I and Jason have seen so far is kind of confirms what we suspect which is that, people devote significant amount of time to their legislative activity. But we'll get you the actual data, I think, Philip, next for the decision meeting, right?
Yeah, as soon as we hit that critical threshold, we'll get some info out to you via email, so you have it in advance. One other thing that we're pulling together is going through for the past term the number of interim meetings. So this is after session. So you're talking the second half of April through the end of the calendar year, and preliminarily we've identified in 2019 we've identified 99 interim meetings. 2020 it was 165. There were a lot of additional meetings with pandemic response and monitoring. And then current through Sunday afternoon for the current 2021 interim, there have been 100 meetings that have been on the hearing schedule. And these will be meetings of a standing committee, a standing committee subcommittee, a joint committee of the legislature, or another work group that's been created by the legislature. So just to give you an additional sense of the interim workload. And once we're still working on 2018. So when we get that, I'll forward that out as supplemental information for you all. The only other item for housekeeping was just we needed to fix the date for the third meeting, which will be in person in Annapolis. Mr. Chair, I don't know if you we can do that offline, or if you wanted to open a further discussion before we move on to that.
Further discussion on the date, or further discussion on anything else?
Further discussion on anything else, if you wanted, we could.
Well, I guess the only other point I would make is, Philip had mentioned that we're open to reviewing all parts of the pension plan. So I would ask that people, if you want to review the other components, Philip and his team have done a good job bringing forward some items that we should consider, but certainly that third meeting, we can use it to have more debate if there's other items that people would want to review in addition to what was presented here. This was just one component, just some components we would consider. So.
Marco, I also wanted to ask and just clarify, with our last meeting, did we still have an interest to have any of the members come and testify about their workload and additional commitments outside of their part-time commitment of being when the legislation is active? If we wanted them to still come and testify.
Yeah, I think we would. I mean, there's open testimony opportunity here, and I think that we would welcome that for the third one as well. I think I don't think there's a reason not to have that. So for the third one, I know we're voting at that one, and it doesn't give us as much time to evaluate the information that they would be providing us, but I still think it's something we would be open to if they want to.
Yeah, and I would say we're really hopeful that we get a good response on the survey, because we've never done this, but I'm really hopeful that we get a good response on the survey to give you that kind of information, not just on an individual level, but kind of like from a global perspective, because I do think that would be very useful for you, and I'm really quite hopeful that we're going to get a decent response.
Yeah, so I think unless anybody was opposed to having that open testimony, I would be in favor of allowing that. Any of the state representatives or any other person from the public to speak there.
Yeah, well, when we get the third meeting set, when the notice goes up online, we'll put a note in there for anyone to contact us if they wish to speak to you all or submit written testimony. Yeah, and so for the final meeting, it'll be, you'll be making your decisions on the resolution. So if you have anything that you want, flag any proposals, let us know. reach out to the chair or us. And we can get those ready for consideration at the final meeting.
And Philip, can you also clarify, you're going to provide the comparative language that you and your team will be suggesting for replacement with the items that we just reviewed as it relates to the pension plan?
Yes, I will get those out to you in advance of the meeting so you can take a look at them.
And I mean, anything that helps you in your terms of your decision making. I mean, we can put together, if people are interested in increasing salaries and they want to use certain benchmarks, we can put those together. I mean, the idea last time around, we put together a decision document which has all of the components of the compensation and the pension plan. And the idea would be to just kind of like know what they are and give options. But as I said, these options, I mean, they really should come from you, not from us. With the obviously, you know, the technical changes to the pension, that is a good thing to do, and that's something you probably wouldn't have been aware of. So that's why we reach out to the State Retirement Agency and to get those done. But any kind of things that you want to look at and you want, you know, you have thoughts about. That's what we can do. And if you just have thoughts on the day, that's fine too. But we definitely can go through every single item quite quickly and just say, okay, does anybody want to change this particular provision or that particular provision? And if so, how do you want to do it? We can try and we'll get that out to you ahead of time if you want, Mr. Chairman, and then you can kind of like start thinking about it ahead of that meeting.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. I had mentioned that to Philip yesterday on the phone, just having a list of all the things for us to consider and some options. And I think some of them would be, you know, things like the meal allowance, hotel allowance, where they've been earmarked to or in line with kind of changes to the federal government levels. I think those may be easier decisions for us to make, but just understanding kind of what the options are, what's currently in place in a way that we could each kind of review in advance and then talk through at the meeting and quickly go through, you know, a yes or no on. Or a decision of each of those, I think would be helpful, but having it a few weeks in advance, and then I can follow up with commission members to get their thoughts on each component would be helpful.
Yeah, in terms of the salaries and expenses line, obviously salaries are what they are, and you can adjust them how you want to adjust them if you want to adjust them. On the expense side, you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the reasons we went through it, we tied over the years, the commission has tied virtually everything to other things that are constantly updated so that they don't have to be updated. The one exception to that is the in-district travel allowance, which is $750 per year. That has not been raised since 2014. And so that may be one, for example, that you want to take a look at specifically and think about raising that. But for the most part, you know, we're outside of the pension system, you know, a lot of the expenses are just tied to other indices because that's frankly the easiest way to do it.
Well, you know, I took a look at the data that you guys put out, and there wasn't a compelling story to raise rates based on what other states are doing. So that, you know, if we would consider that, it would have to be for some other reason. You know, the average salary of Maryland is 22% of the comparable states. So we're above there. We're the third highest paid of other hybrid states and 13th overall. And, you know, 82% of legislators have other jobs. So there wasn't any compelling thing saying we needed to adjust salaries. So I needed to come up with what would be the reasons we would do that. So, I mean, the data didn't show that, so.
I would just like to share as it relates to the salary, some of the things that I was personally looking at is one, just as I shared with the last meeting, technological changes, just an advance in technology commitment outside of the ongoing three-month commitment. As I've reviewed some of our active legislators, that they do events and participate in committees year round. And true to your point that a lot are employed outside of their commitment, but in part they have to, right? When you look at what they're currently paid, who in the state of Maryland can survive off that salary? And I've seen, and I'll list out some of the legislators whom I've been watching closely, Republican and Democrat alike, that are very active in their community. And just looking at the in-district travel allowance, for example, $750. Just some of the activity that I've seen by some of our representatives, they're very committed to their communities and the service that they provide. So I think that's something worth, looking at. Times have changed, and salaries and allowances should adapt accordingly. That's just my opinion.
So to reply to what you were saying, it's 70, the current salary is 78% of the median personal income in Maryland. So the salary for a 3-month job, 6-month job, you could even say 6 months of full time, it's still 78% of what personal income is in Maryland. So as I said, I didn't see anything that was like driving the answer from the data we had. Maybe there's some other reasons, but the data didn't say there was a need. And there's about a 25% turnover every 4 years, which is, I would say that's probably about normal. So.
For Simon and Philip, I wonder if some of the survey data may shed light on or answer a question on some of the job demands that maybe aren't captured just by looking at a comparison versus a full-time versus a hybrid model. I mean, I think the notion that they're part-time or hybrid is I just reject it. I think it's false. There's no member of the General Assembly that's working in a part-time position, certainly not most of them. So I think we've got to get away from that thinking that this is a job that you do for 3 months, January to April, and then you just you're done, you wipe your hands and you go about your business. That is not the reality. I think that anyone that's been closely involved with the legislature understands or knows. So I think maybe that survey data will provide will shed light on some of the work and some of the things that they're doing. Because if I think to some of the points are right, how do you square the points of you've got a job that's technically 3 months out of the year on paper, but in any practical sense and in any sense of reality is 12 months out of the year.
So Lester, I'll agree with you that it isn't just after 9 months, or 3 months, it turns off. I agree with you. They probably do work throughout the year. I don't disagree with that at all. I would say, though, that with 81% of them having a full-time job, that isn't a full-time for majority of them. We don't have a lack of people wanting to get into the job. So that I just don't see the data telling us that there's some other reason that we might want to consider.
Excuse me, is there any data, survey, anything that says that the current salary is a deterrent at all to seeking these offices?
I mean, not Maryland specific. I mean, there's plenty of discussion in legislative fora about the issues around salary levels, but it's not. It's anecdotal. Jason, Philip, and I have all read articles about concerns about salary levels at through the National Conference of State Legislators and other publications, but it's not something that you could point to and say, oh yeah, it's very Maryland specific. So I mean, those articles are out there, but then they're not necessarily gonna be, oh yes, here's a survey of Maryland legislators about salaries and stuff like that. No.
Right. And I mean, is there any information that would suggest that if the salary were to increase, let's just say by 15%, is there a harm at all, or is there a perception that that's too high, or adequate? And what would we use as a basis if we wanted to increase
Right. I mean, I don't know in terms of the perception of whether something would be high or not. I mean, as I said in the last meeting, the thing that struck me the most was actually the number of states that have actually increased salaries in the last 4 years. It was over half, or about half. I think to Mr. Rakowski's point, I mean, there's always a little danger comparing states. I mean, we provide all this data because that's the data we have available. We want to show you what different states do, what different state levels are. There's always a danger in that, as I say, because some states, I mean, they're still getting $100 a year. I mean, clearly you're in it for a different motivation if you're getting paid $100 a year. But you know, the issue, I think, I am hopeful that with the data we get on the full-time nature of the job, that will actually provide you with some additional context to what the legislators are doing. Because I know, again, it's, you know, from my own personal experience in the last over 30 years, that what happens now in the interim and the session compared to what was happening 30 years ago is very different. But we'll see how that data plays out when we get it from the surveys, hopefully.
Mr. Rakowski did bring up a good point, though. You know, the median, regardless of if it's part-time, even if this was considered a full-time job, it's still above the median wage of Maryland.
No, it's below the.
It's a little. It's right.
It's about 7. I think did you say 78%? I think
It's 78% is what it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, maybe I'm not proposing this, I'm just saying, you know, because you got to, if you want to tag it to something, you know, maybe you could come up with a model that says, hey, we want to pay them this percentage of Maryland's median personal income or some number. I'm not proposing that. I'm just, again, trying to come up with, if there was a reason to increase salary, what do we base it on? We're currently, as I said, the third highest paid in the hybrid states. We can't base it on that. We're already 22% over the average of the hybrid states. So we'd have to, something to hang our hats on, as they say. Oh, and there was, I think it was it Lawrence was asking, the only thing that I could find regarding people leaving the job, I think that's what you were asking, is right now the average service is 16 years for the senators and 8 years for the representatives. So that's the average service. So it seems like people are staying in at least for 2 or 3 terms. So.
And Simon, I just wanted to confirm that the survey data, you expect to have that to us in a good amount of time before our next meeting so we can review it. And in addition to the testimony, so we're going to have both. We're going to have testimonies from current legislators as well as the data back from the survey that you've issued.
The testimony will be up to a member approaching the commission. You know, historically, members haven't participated given the independent nature of the commission and the nature of its charge.
Okay. Have you queried members to come forth?
We've done the survey. That's you know, they know that as members, they know that they're able to approach.
Got it.
I mean, does it make sense to just make sure that the presiding officers know that there's one more public meeting that's going to be coming up, and that would be the last opportunity for any legislators to weigh in? I'm not suggesting contacting all legislators, but at least putting the presiding officers on notice.
Yeah, they're Mr. Gallagher, sorry, they're very aware of their schedule.
Okay.
Yeah.
And, you know, Simon or Philip, I know that it's a separate process, but I think I had read maybe earlier this week that the Executive Compensation Committee has met and reached its conclusions, right?
For the governor constitutional officers?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was right before the holiday.
And in all of the kind of data that's been provided so far and discussions, I'm curious if there is any kind of precedent or history of the recommendations between these two independent commissions kind of tracking similarly, and like what the legislature's like final actions have been. I don't remember seeing any kind of side by side on the constitutional officers versus legislators. And I don't know if it's a valid, comparison point, but I could see certain people in the public kind of lining those two things up and seeing what conclusions were reached.
Yeah, I mean, they're two separate commissions, obviously. And you're right. Actually, normally oftentimes the General Assembly Compensation Commission comes first and the governors come second. This time around, it was the other way around. I mean, they generally they follow similar trends, I said similar patterns, shall we say? But the actual mechanism and the basis for their decisions might be quite different. But normally speaking, I think I would say in my experience, if the Legislative Commission recommends an increase, the Governor's Salary Commission recommends an increase, and if they don't, they don't. They do kind of go in tandem. But that's not something that you have to follow at all.
No, but I mean, it might be helpful, particularly for some of the other members of the committee, just to know what was recommended for the constitutional officers, just so that they have
Sure.
that as well.
Yeah, sure. We can. I mean, I have this. I have the information. We can get that information to you and show you what they recommended for sure.
Okay. And I don't know how the other commission members feel. I mean, I would just say, I think that the materials DLS have put together are exhaustive, and there's just an incredible amount of data. And I just wonder, from the the other committee members' perspectives, if there are any kind of core principles that people feel strongly about in terms of, we want to be in the top 20%, or we want to be at the top end of the hybrid, grouping. If there are any kind of principles, putting the numbers aside for a minute, like where we think we'd want to be, that might help kind of guide the discussion and the crafting of the actual recommendations.
I mean, I can open up the discussion. I think the wage adjusted median compensation was helpful. I think certainly not wanting to be below kind of the midpoint of that is, I think being at the top half is something that I think would be reasonable, or at the median of that kind of group, I think is a reasonable target. Obviously, we're at the high end. I certainly don't want to be in the, I wouldn't want to be in the bottom half of that peer group, but I don't think it's unreasonable to target a median over time. But obviously, we're on the high end of that, and I think we'd need some justification on why we're at the high end on a wage adjusted basis, whether that's of retention, the need to attract and retain quality representatives, or that the work is disproportional to other hybrid legislatures. So I think we need some data to support being at the high end to use taxpayer dollars to fund that. So that's just my kind of first thought based on your question.
Thanks.
I will certainly reiterate to the presiding officers the importance of getting that survey data to you, because I think that will be particularly useful. And obviously mention the testimony question. Again, I agree with Philip. It's not usual that legislators want to come to testify on their own salaries. My recollection is Congress usually does this in the dead of night. But we'll certainly get the data that you need to get on the time constraints and the time issues, because I think those are very important.
Right. And the other thing too, when we were pulling together the information on the meetings, when I get that out to you, I'll also note, those are official meetings, and so when something rises to the level of going in the public hearing schedule for a formal hearing, there's often been a lot of activity and discussion and constituent and advocate contact to around an issue that rises to the level of the meeting. So as you can see, there's many meetings that are held over the interim. So that's contextually, I think you should think of that in terms of the work that goes into getting it to the point of having a meeting.
Philip, one housekeeping type thing. When could you let us know if there's any special process we need to follow to get into the building now with the COVID and
yes,
et cetera?
Yeah, I'll follow up with you all on that when we I think we'll go when we end the meeting here. We can, if everyone can hang out, we can sort out that final meeting date. But yeah, currently the process, we have process in place, so I'll make sure that everyone's clear on that.
I guess I just want to be clear on something. I mean, so if we're looking for a justification for increasing compensation, I mean, is it not enough justification to just have a cost of living increase because presumably the prior commissions have established the compensation at a certain target relative to other states, all the other information. So is it not enough to just have that be the basis, to try to keep us in line with, where we would have been 4 years ago relative to other states and so on? So, my question is because it sounds to me from all the data that we've talked about that the workload is certainly increasing, and throughout the years, and they did not have they didn't have a compensation increase the last time. So, and there's also been a cost of living increase.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think for COLA, certainly, I think there's more than enough justification if you're talking about just a COLA. And like to your point, they haven't had one. That's the minimum in my mind. So I agree.
Are you both suggesting a COLA increase starting when this gets put in place going forward, or a COLA that also makes up for the last 4 years on top of it, just to clarify?
I wasn't suggesting that. That's certainly something we can talk about and debate, but I was thinking about initially moving forward. I wasn't thinking about retroactive.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay.
Still would like to have some type of data that tells me what I'm supposed to be doing as opposed to a feeling that I should be doing something. So I wouldn't jump on board with the automatic COLA. I need to see why we're going to give the increase, especially since the salary is already, when you compare it to other states, we're already the highest, or not that we are not the highest, but we're in the top. So.
Well, I would agree that if they haven't gotten an increase in a while, that we should consider it. But I would want to know what we would tie the COLA to. What would be the baseline for it?
There are a number of options on that. I mean, you can do changes in CPI. There's also changes in state employee compensation over whatever period you're interested in looking at.
Yeah, we can provide you with a list of options so that, and again, if you have any specific options, Mr. Rakowski's option may be 0, which is fine, but it's like we can give you a lot of different options how you want to go, and then see what you want to do.
But if we go down a road of considering COLA, I would like to know what some of the other public employees are getting, because I don't want to give a COLA to the legislators that is more than what the public employees might be getting from a COLA.
Right, and we definitely match it up like we did. We showed you the data last time around. We've matched it up to what state employees have received in the last 4 years when legislative salaries have stayed flat.
What would be the thought on a lump sum payment? Let's assume that there's some story. I'm making up a story here. Let's assume that there is a justification saying that because of COVID, there was an extra workload, et cetera, and instead of increasing salaries in recognition of some extra workload, I'm making this up because I don't have any data, we provide an X amount lump sum payment as opposed to increasing salaries. Is that something that would be available to us, or is that tool not available to us?
You could do a lump sum payment, but you have to remember that you're setting the compensation for the next term. You're setting forward compensation. You're not setting backward compensation. So
got it.
That becomes a problem.
All right, got it. All right, I understand now. All right.
Thank you.
I would just throw out there too, that having worked on labor negotiations with the state represented employees, that like a lump sum payment was typically done during, challenging economic environments where you were worried about the scoring of the increase in terms of the cumulative effect going forward. So if it was non-recurring, it was a way to, manage the economic impact and the pension impact. And that's not to say that it doesn't have an impact with the legislature, but when you're talking about a couple of hundred people as opposed to tens of thousands of people, it's just a dramatically different scale. That's not to minimize the importance of this decision, but it's just for some context. And just as relates to Ms. Dipple, if I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, her comment, I think, prospectively, given where the state is, given the lack of action 4 years ago, whether you call it a COLA or an inflationary adjustment, I think that there's ample justification for that, just given other salary actions that have happened at the state for state employees and the actions that are being contemplated right now. And to the extent we need to, quote, hang our hat on something, I think there are data points that are available to us in the packet that has already been provided by DLS, or any additional information that we want to develop. I would just put out there that, I am comfortable being, towards the higher end of the relative scale, given the importance of the work. And, trying to kind of get everybody at the median, in terms of our comparisons to other states. I mean, I just think that there's a lot of data that's out there, and we can probably pick, any set of data points that we want to kind of justify our position. But, being in that top quarter or top 20%, I don't think is a bad thing in terms of investing in the legislature, trying to attract and retain the best people possible, and making this, a viable position that's going to continue to attract interested people. I'll get off my soapbox now.
Just to shift gears just a little bit, Philip and Simon, can you just confirm as it relates to the allowances currently allocated for the legislator. Did you previously say it was tied to indices? That more so the data to support the allowances provided, for example, in district travel, what was that connected to? Or what was the basis for that?
So a lot of the expense components, so lodging, mileage, things like that are tied to federal governmental rates.
Right.
Same for other state employees.
I mean the allowances. So for example, I think you just quoted earlier in district travel allowances at $750 per year. Where did that 750 number come from?
I mean, that's the one that is not tied. And it was basically, I mean, at some point there was an in-district allowance. It was at 250, then it got raised to 500. It wasn't tied to anything specifically, but it was, I mean, as I said, it hasn't been raised since, I just noted that one today, just thinking about the decision meeting, that one hasn't been raised since 2014. And, you know, that one is just, it's just a dollar amount. There's no real, because it's non-vouchered, and non-vouchered means basically that members get it. They don't have to submit receipts, mileage claims or anything like that to get it. So we don't have any data as to how much that covers or doesn't cover what the members actually do. But you can imagine in terms of if you travel around a district, and I think, especially when you talk about some of the more rural districts, people travel a lot of miles, a lot more so perhaps than in more urban areas, but still, it's just a dollar number.
Okay, if I could just ask, and I'll go back to the report, if you're able, since we have one meeting left, I would love to at least have some important elements highlighted as it relates to allowances granted that were not, voted on per the last commission session. So I just would like to see, where the delta hasn't changed on some of the major items that support our legislator.
Sure. I mean, I can tell you that what we did last go around, for example, we produced a decision document which has all of those allowances in them, and we just went through them. And unless somebody wanted to change it, we discussed it all like we did in that first meeting. We went through and explained what's what payments relate to what. Unless somebody wanted to change it, the commission basically just withheld any change. And as I say, for the most part, since they are tied to state mileage allowances, state travel reimbursement, the GSA, General Services Administration, hotel rates, since they're tied to those things, I think for the most part, the commission members were comfortable that there was no real need to change it. And the in-district travel, it was noted that it was 750. There wasn't any, I don't believe there was any specific discussion around it, but we can go, we can put a document together that has all that, but it's really, as I say, that's that and before you get to the pensions, it's that and the salaries are the two areas where people probably have the most thinking about, because everything else is tied to an index, and there's no real reason, I don't think, to change it at this point, because it seems to be working well for everybody.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mr. Chair, I mean, how do you envision kind of the third and decision meeting going? I mean, like, should we be formulating, a handful of options that we ask kind of DLS and the staff to, articulate for us, so that, like, there's a, no action, just everything stays the same, inflationary increase, and then, an option that kind of keeps Maryland at the forefront of their category of legislative pay. And then we have three things that we're kind of tangibly discussing at the last meeting. I'm just curious, like, what your thought is in terms of what happens between now and the final meeting.
Well, I guess what was described, I talked to Philip a little bit about this yesterday as far as kind of how this could be structured. One way would be to just vote on the package as a whole. It sounds like probably we want to vote on some individually, or at least have individualized discussion around. And I think that having that document pulled together where we could begin brainstorming what we would propose as a commission. So the staff doesn't make recommendations here that we vote on. We're really tasked with formulating those and voting on them ourselves, although Philip and his team will help us frame that. So I think having that initial document for us to then circulate and discuss as a commission, probably before that meeting, so that we have options that each commission member, if they feel strongly about one item wanting to be proposed, whether it's a COLA adjustment of 2.5% or whatever it is, if we can lay that out for us as a commission to vote on. That's how, and then we would work leading up to that meeting to finalize that document so that we could vote on it at that meeting, would be how I would envision, unless others feel differently about how we would structure that. I think some of the votes would be pretty easy to go through, and there's probably only a few that would rise to the top that would require more dialogue, but
Yeah, I guess, Mike, I think maybe to put a little finer point on it, like if there is a certain level of work that has to happen between the second and third meeting that you just described, does that happen in work sessions? Does that have to be in public meeting? I understand the recommendations have to be ours and that we have to vote for them, but I mean, I think we have to be somewhat prescriptive to the team that's supporting the commission to really tee things up in a way that they're actionable and provide a certain level of direction. And does that happen just with a lot of back and forth between all of us and the staff between the second and third meetings? Can that happen outside of a public meeting? I think I'm more process driven with these questions right now.
I did not envision having another working session, but given that we have a little bit of time until then, I would be open to that if people would want to, once that document is crafted, having a 30 or 45-minute working session. I don't know if does that need to be public, or could we as a commission get together and work through the details of that document on our own? Phil?
I'd have to check. I think if you're talking the full commission, I think that would need to be a public meeting.
Okay.
Marco, I would support another working meeting. I think there are some, this is salaries and support for our legislators on the line. So I don't mind making that additional commitment to ensure, we get it right.
And the focus of that would be to finalize and make sure that document is ready for us to vote on, and that we've had enough debate and laid out enough options for us to make a decision on by the following meeting.
I mean, Mr. Chair, do you feel like that we've given enough direction to populate the memo that we would be voting on at the third meeting?
I mean, I think we've gone through each of the components, but we need to finalize, are we proposing 0, 2.5, COLA? What we have not given enough direction to the staff right now at this point to say, these are what we need to work through. And if we feel like we could do that, if people want to do that, via email and phone calls, and then communicate that to the staff, that's one way to approach this. Or if we feel like we need to get together, now that we've seen all the different components, to get back and have a quicker session to lay those out, and email in advance to Philip what we would like to frame out, and I can work with him and just have a shorter session. That would be, I don't think we've given them enough guidance right now on what to put on paper. In my opinion, I don't know if you feel differently.
No, I agree. I'm trying to be sensitive to the team that's supporting us. And I guess, I'll put a little bit of a stalking horse out there, a no action, inflationary action, and a high action. that if we fleshed out like 3 options that we could look at, kind of line up against the data that's already been provided to us, then we would be able to ask some questions. We'd be able to kind of negotiate an outcome maybe a little bit more easily in the third and final work session. I wasn't looking necessarily to add another public meeting. I just want to make sure that we're providing ample direction to the team that's supporting the work of the commission.
Mr. Chairman, I feel like, we can certainly, we have plenty of options to, let's just assume, obviously no increase is no increase. That's an easy thing to say. If you're looking for options, we can develop options on the salary and circulate them around. Philip is going to have to draft the actual language on all the pension stuff, and we can send that around. The issue, if the biggest question is going to be looking at the salaries, we can certainly pull together some options. We can show you what the Governor's Commission just recommended for the constitutional officers. We can kind of give you those different options and tie them to different indices. And then you all can kind of like take a look at that. And, if you need to, if you want to have another meeting on that, or if you just want to converse amongst yourselves, that's great. But we can do that, I think, fairly easily. I think there are definitely different options that we can pull together based on the discussion that you all have had today. I don't think I have any issue with saying that we can't do that.
Okay, then why don't we plan on doing that, and then we'll have discussion outside of this among us, and then if we feel like we need to come back together. I like having the low, medium, and high options as debate points, and I think the lower end of it is no increase for each of these, and then the middle is probably in the cost of living, and then a higher end would be something that you all would feel, and having some of those cost of living benchmarks would be helpful. And I think it's base salary, it's the allowances are really the buckets, and I think the allowances are pretty straightforward. And then the pension would be the rates within those pensions. It sounds like we do have some latitude within there, although they haven't changed. And then I think the language would just be a fourth bucket of just language and cleanup items. Is the way I'm envisioning that.
Sorry, I'd throw it out there. The other thing to consider is, in addition to what you want to do, it's how you want to get there. If you decide to go a certain route, do you want to do it over a period of the term, or do you want to do it all up front? There's no, you can do either one, but in the past, if they've said, okay, we want to give, I'm going to throw a number out. We want to give a $4,000 increase, and we want to do 1,000 per year. So, each year the salary goes up by 1,000. Well, you might say, hey, we want to do a $4,000 increase. Let's just do a $4,000 increase. That's the base, and it's going to be in effect for the whole 4 years. So that's the other aspect of what you might want to think about when you see these things, and the other discussion point. And you are free to choose whichever one you as a commission want to do.
Simon, when do you think you'd be in a position to kind of share what I've been calling like an articulation of those options?
I think probably we'd want to get into you in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah.
Okay. And what's the target date for the third and final meeting?
So we were looking at sometime after the new year, between the 3rd and the 11th. I don't know if you want to, Mr. Chair, if you want to, we can do this offline if you want. I don't know if people are comfortable discussing their schedules on a public feed, but
I think we can. I think offline, we had some email traffic. I think we were getting close to a date.
Yeah. So if there's nothing else anyone wanted to discuss, we can adjourn the meeting, and then if everyone could stay on, we could set up that final date.
So move to adjourn.
Yep.
Second.
Let me check with support staff. We may need to relog in.